Green Party co-leader Chloe Swarbrick says last week's budget has reinforced the unfairness of the tax system. She joins me now.
Kia ora.
Kia ora. So, surely the raising of the thresholds, though, there isn't a degree of fairness in that, isn't there, in the sense that people on relatively low incomes have been starting to be caught by these higher marginal tax rates.
Yeah, for sure. But the point that we're making here is that the decisions on these tax cuts have continued to entrench a fundamentally unfair and unequitable tax system. And I find it really interesting if you dig into some of the commentary that the Minister of Finance has provided in some of the subsidiary papers to the budget, where she has cherry-picked statements from both the IMF and the OECD in order to rationalise some of the decisions that they're making, but ignored their very recent pleas to fix the fact that we do not currently have a meaningful capital gains tax, which both of them say will lead to a more productive economy. And that is also one of the key goals that she's set herself with regard to fiscal strategy. So unless we are willing to address that elephant in the room, we will continue to see capital flow into particularly bidding up the cost of housing, which comes at the expense of pretty much everything else.
And, I mean, obviously, you're not particularly happy with interest deductibility for landlords being brought back.
Yeah, I mean, again, part of the reason, as we've discussed before, that the Labour-led government put that on the table is because they themselves, I'm assuming, had ruled out a capital gains tax, wealth tax, or any other form of kind of rebalancing the tax system to that effect. So I guess in the context of the tax system as it currently operates and the decisions made to wind back or make those changes around tax deductibility, that we are going to see a drop over the next 4 years of $2.9 billion going into the government coffers, which could be spent on, for example, reducing inequality or, I don't know, funding state housing, which in turn reduces crime. Meanwhile, the government's making decisions to invest in building a mega prison, but not in the fence at the top of the cliff. We also have had RBNZ in front of us at multiple hearings over the last few weeks where we've put and stress tested that $2.9 billion tax cut for landlords with them. And it has been quite interesting to also step through the fact that it has actually removed the relative incentive for new builds as well, because you'll be aware that there was that exclusion with the tax deductibility rules.
And so do you accept to or not the Finance Minister's argument that all the tax cuts are fully funded through cost savings and other revenue measures?
No. And, you know, you've had economists from both the left and the right and the centre saying that it's kind of cute to make that argument, right? The budget needs to be read in totality. And the reality is the government is borrowing more and it is making decisions to take these tax cuts. If it was not, then it would not be needing to be borrowing as much. And it's taken a pretty merciless approach to slashing programs across social issues, across climate issues and across environmental issues. And that's probably another really key point that we as the Greens would make, which other parties might not, which is that there are some really serious threats to the integrity of the emissions trading scheme with the funding cuts here in this budget as well.
And also, I mean, in terms of the operating allowance, $3.2 billion for this coming financial year, but actually less in years out. Do you actually think the government will be able to keep within those spending limits?
Again, as we've seen and as we've kind of stress tested with officials during the budget lockup and just that hour that we had before it was released publicly, those are premised on some pretty shaky assumptions, the likes of which not confronting another massive climate change charge weather event in the next 2 years or so. So to that effect, yeah, it's really tight. And I believe that the Minister has not given herself all too much headroom for any of the unprecedented events which now seem to be confronting us pretty much every 6 months.
Who do you think comes out best and worst from this budget?
Well, I think that the budget absolutely, as we were just talking about before we came on air, delivers on the things that National have said that they want to deliver on, which is tax cuts at the expense of pretty much everything else. And to that effect, we can say that it's a pretty short-term minded budget. It's kicking the can down the road on some of the massive issues that we face with regard to inequality being amongst the highest that it has ever been on record in this country, with regard to potential kind of flow-on effects for homelessness. And we had just the other day, I was asking the Prime Minister in the House about 5 key indicators that the Auckland Council has identified which will see an increase in homelessness in our largest city, which the government has control over. For example, changing those rules around evictions for Kianga order tenants and no-cause evictions and a range of other factors. So I think that this is going to exacerbate some of these longer-term challenges that we're facing, not the least in the social sector, but also when it comes to our environment.
Because I think the budget is forecasting, isn't it, that the number of children in poverty will rise?
Yeah, so it'll plateau or it will rise. So we're currently looking at about 63,000 children, and it's a pretty dismal state of affairs when the child poverty report is 4 pages long, and the government is basically conceding that it's taking no meaningful action whatsoever to deal with that crisis. And that, again, just continues to kick the can down the road. But if you're to look at the flow-on effects when it comes to actually, even from a social investment approach, far higher costs that are going to be confronted in the health system, the education system and the criminal justice system, we should be investing in those kids at the start of their lives.
And coming back to the comment you made about a productive economy, I mean, one of the things in the budget too, the Treasury is, seems to be incredibly concerned about the level of productivity growth. I think 0.2% a year over the last decade. I mean, do you see anything in the budget that's going to lift productivity?
No. And I would put that question to the Minister. I mean, she would argue, and I heard her arguing in the House this week, that, she expects that simply giving tax cuts is somehow going to increase productivity. But again, what all of the evidence tells us is that the way that we have set up our tax system foundationally, which is the point that we were talking about at the top of this interview, is that we see a disproportionate amount of capital flow into housing in particular. So if we want to see that going into the productive economy, into creating jobs and meaningful jobs, then we need to fix the tax system in such a way that we do not see that preferential treatment for housing.
And that what fundamental fix from your point of view is a capital gains tax?
The Greens have campaigned for the last 2 elections on a wealth tax.
So a wealth tax rather than a capital gains tax, because there is quite a difference.
There is a difference, absolutely. But the point that we've made about a wealth tax is that would also now allow us to generate the revenue for government to spend on things which ultimately improve people's lives, ensure that we are able to take adequate climate action, but then also in turn increase productivity, but also reduce costs for those gnarly, what happens when you kick the can down the road on these issues, as I was alluding to before. If you're making people's lives harder, then more people are going to end up having to interact with the healthcare system, with the criminal justice system, with the housing system, with the social development, with the Ministry of Social Development. So if we want to, again, put a fence at the top of the cliff, it may look like more money up front, but as even I think Sir Bill English would say, we would save money in the long run.
And so, I mean, in terms of that debate on tax, you would tax more overall?
Yes.
What in terms of, I guess, proportion of GDP, though, what
the classic arbitrary figure, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what level of taxation as proportion of GDP do you think is necessary to fund the sorts of things you're talking about?
I mean, look, I am very wary of getting into and down kind of putting an arbitrary figure on it, and we have seemed to, in this country, kind of rallied around the fact that we've set the figure at around 30% for, most of my lifetime. And to that effect, what kind of outcomes have we seen from chasing that figure? We have seen homelessness go up. We have seen worse educational outcomes. We have seen, inequality rise. We have seen the can kick down the road on climate action. So I think that the question should actually be, what kind of outcomes are we trying to get out of our economy when it comes to social and environmental and climate gains, as opposed to necessarily sticking an arbitrary figure on it.
Chloe Sawbrook, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
For more content just like this and all the latest business and political news, head over to mbr.co.nz.